The city's new billion-dollar skyscraper was about to collapse. The star architect was clueless, but the old woman who cleaned his office saw the fatal flaw in the blueprints. She knew because she was the one who had designed the support system he had stolen and misunderstood. To the ambitious, sharp-suited architects of Sterling and Croft, she was a part of the building's quiet hum. Maria, a 68-year-old black woman with a gentle limp and hands that were calloused from a lifetime of hard work. She was the night shift cleaner for the executive floor, a silent presence who emptied trash bins filled with crumpled sketches and polished the glass walls of conference rooms where the future of the city's skyline was decided. They saw an old, tired woman, a ghost in a gray uniform who moved through their world of sharp angles and brilliant designs without leaving a trace. They never suspected they were looking at Dr. Maria Jones, a visionary structural engineer whose career had been destroyed 30 years ago. She had been a pioneer in tensile dynamics, the architect of a revolutionary support system that was supposed to make impossible buildings possible. But after a catastrophic project failure, a failure she had predicted and for which she was unjustly blamed, the industry had blacklisted her. She had lost her license, her reputation, and her name, eventually finding a strange, quiet peace in the anonymity of cleaning the offices of the very men who had built their careers on the ruins of hers. The crisis began on the 40th floor, in the heart of Sterling and Croft's empire. It centered around the Apex, a skyscraper so audacious, so impossibly slender and twisted, that it was set to redefine architectural history. It was the project that would make a legend of the firm's young star, a 30-year-old prodigy named Julian Croft. But the Apex was in trouble. The final stage structural simulations were perfect. The supercomputers, running models that cost thousands of dollars an hour, all agreed. The building was a masterpiece of stability. Yet the physical scale model, a marvel of engineering in its own right, was telling a different story. Microfractures, invisible to the naked eye, were appearing in the core support columns. A fine, metallic dust, like a strange, silver sand, was collecting at its base. And sometimes, in the dead of night when the building was silent, the model would emit a faint, high-pitched hum, the sound of a structure screaming under a stress no one could explain. Julian Croft was on the verge of a breakdown. He was a man who believed in data, in the pure, clean logic of his computer models. The physical world's refusal to conform to his digital perfection was an infuriating betrayal. "It's impossible," he shouted, his voice echoing in the vast, minimalist studio where the model stood like a silent accusation. "Run the simulations again. Check the material composition. There is no flaw." His team of young, brilliant engineers, all with degrees from the best schools, could only nod in weary agreement. They had run the simulations 100 times. They had analyzed the custom-forged steel of the model down to the molecular level. The design was perfect. The model was failing. The contradiction was threatening to derail the entire $2 billion project. From the hallway, where she was carefully polishing the floor-to-ceiling windows, Maria watched. She had been a silent witness to the growing crisis for weeks. She had listened to the hushed, frantic conversations. She had seen the crumpled, discarded printouts filled with equations that all led to the same wrong answer. And she had seen the fine, silver dust at the base of the model, a sight that made her blood run cold. Unlike the architects, she wasn't looking at the computer screens. She was listening to the building. Her ears, trained by a lifetime of understanding the secret music of structures, heard the faint, high-pitched hum for what it was, harmonic resonance. Her eyes, which could see the soul of a building in its load-bearing columns, saw the truth in the microfractures. The design wasn't just flawed, it was a death trap. Julian, in his quest for a sleek, impossibly elegant design, had made a critical, amateur mistake. He had misunderstood the principles of her own stolen design. The Jones Matrix, a system of dynamic tension supports that Sterling and Croft had acquired, rebranded as the Sterling Core, and patented after her disgrace. He had used her system, but he had ignored its most fundamental rule: a building, like a living thing, must be allowed to breathe. He had made the core too rigid, creating a perfect tuning fork that would, under the right wind conditions, resonate with the building's natural frequency until it literally shook itself apart. The same catastrophic flaw she had been fired for predicting 30 years ago. She had tried to warn them, in her own quiet way. She had approached a young, kind-eyed engineer a week prior, a woman named Sarah who sometimes offered her a polite good evening. "Excuse me, miss," Maria had said, her voice soft and hesitant. She pointed with her dust rag towards the model. "I was just noticing. Does it ever seem to hum to you? My old house used to do that when the wind was just right. Drove my cat crazy." Sarah had looked at her with a mixture of pity and confusion. "It's just the ventilation system, Maria," she had said gently. "Thank you for your concern." The dismissal was kind, but absolute. Maria knew then that a simple hint would never be enough. They were trapped in their world of digital perfection, deaf to the physical truth screaming right in front of them. With the final sign-off on the construction phase just days away, Maria knew she had to do something. To remain silent would be to let them build a $2 billion tombstone in the heart of the city. That night, after the last of the panicked architects had gone home, Maria let herself into the darkened studio. She wasn't a cleaner anymore. She was an engineer, and this was her building. She walked to Julian's massive desk, where the master blueprints for the apex were spread out under a soft lamplight. She looked at the elegant, beautiful, fatally flawed lines of the design. She saw her own stolen genius, twisted and misunderstood by a generation that valued aesthetics over integrity. From the pocket of her simple gray uniform, she pulled out a red pen. With a hand that did not tremble, she made a single, devastating correction. She didn't add anything. She simply drew one clean, red line through a single, critical support column, the column that was making the entire structure too rigid. And at the bottom of the page, she wrote a simple, cryptic equation, the core mathematical principle of her original Jones matrix. An equation that had been conspicuously absent from the Sterling core patent. She left the corrected blueprint on his desk, a silent, anonymous scream of truth in a world of beautiful lies. Then she turned and disappeared back into the shadows of the building, leaving the ghost of a solution for the star architect to find in the morning. The summons from the penthouse arrived at the beginning of Maria's next shift. The day shift supervisor, a woman who usually barely acknowledged her, approached with an unreadable expression. "Mr. Croft wants to see you," she said, her tone a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "In the design studio. Now." A quiet murmur went through the other cleaners who were gathering their supplies. A night shift cleaner being summoned to the executive floor was unheard of. It was a violation of the building's unspoken caste system. It could only mean one thing. She was being fired for some unknown transgression. Maria simply nodded, her face betraying no emotion. She calmly placed her mop back in its rack, removed her worn work gloves, and followed the supervisor to the executive elevator. As she ascended, she felt not fear, but a strange, quiet resolve. The ghost had been summoned from the basement. The haunting was about to begin. The design studio was a cathedral of tense silence. Julian Croft stood before the scale model of the apex, his back to the door. His team of young engineers was gathered around a large monitor, pretending to work but casting nervous glances in his direction. They all turned as Maria entered, her simple gray uniform a stark contrast to the studio's expensive, minimalist aesthetic. Julian turned slowly. The arrogance was gone from his face, replaced by a raw, unsettling intensity. He held up the blueprint she had marked. "Did you do this?" he asked, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual theatricality. Maria looked at the red line, at her own elegant equation. She met his gaze without flinching. "Yes," she said. The single word landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. The engineers stared, their mouths agape. It was one thing to see the proof in the simulation. It was another to hear the confession from the lips of the stooped, elderly cleaning woman standing before them. "How?" Julian asked, the word a mix of awe and accusation. "That equation. It's not in any textbook. My team ran a search. It doesn't exist in any published academic journal. How do you know it?" "Some things are not learned in books," Maria replied, her voice soft but carrying the weight of decades. "They are learned by listening. That building," she gestured toward the model, "was screaming. You were just too busy with your computers to hear it." The engineers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Her words, simple and metaphorical, were a more damning critique of their failure than any technical analysis. Julian's pride, the very foundation of his identity, was at war with the irrefutable evidence on his computer screen. He was a prodigy, a genius. He did not get saved by cleaners. But the facts were undeniable. He was desperate, and this unassuming old woman was the only person in the world who had the answer. "The line," he said, pointing to the blueprint. "You crossed out a primary support column. That's structural suicide. But the simulation, it works. Explain it." "You built a cage," Maria said, walking slowly toward the model. She didn't look at Julian, but at the flawed structure. "You made the core too rigid. You were so focused on strength that you forgot about flexibility. A skyscraper this tall needs to move, to sway with the wind like a tree. Your design fights the wind. It creates a resonance, a vibration that will eventually shake it to pieces." She gently touched the base of the model, where the fine, silver dust had collected. "This is the proof. The metal is already fatiguing, crying out under the strain." She then pointed to the red line on the blueprint. "That column is the source of the rigidity. By removing it, you don't weaken the structure. You liberate it. You allow the tensile forces to be distributed throughout the entire matrix, turning the building from a rigid tuning fork into a flexible, interwoven web. You allow it to breathe." Sarah, the young engineer, gasped in recognition. "The Jones matrix," she whispered, the name from her university textbooks clicking into place. "The theoretical support system from the 80s. They said it was brilliant but unstable. That the engineer behind it." She trailed off, looking at Maria with dawning, impossible understanding. Julian's head snapped up. He stared at Maria, truly seeing her for the first time. The quiet dignity. The hands that, though calloused, moved with an engineer's precision. The eyes that held a deep, weary intelligence. He remembered the name on her file. Maria Jones. "You," he breathed, the word a stunned accusation. "You're that Dr. Jones. The one who was disgraced. The one who designed the Matrix." The ghost finally had a name. The room was silent, the weight of 30 years of stolen history settling upon them. "They said your design failed," one of the younger engineers said, his voice a mixture of confusion and awe. "The Hartford Bridge collapse." "My design was not built," Maria said, her voice cold with the memory of an ancient injustice. "My design was altered by men who valued cost-cutting over safety. I warned them. I told them that making the core rigid to save on materials would lead to catastrophic failure. They fired me for it. They blamed me when the bridge collapsed exactly as I had predicted." And then she looked directly at Julian. "Your firm's founder, Mr. Sterling, bought my patents for pennies on the dollar at the bankruptcy auction, rebranded my life's work as the Sterling Core, and built his empire on my ruin." The story, delivered without a trace of self-pity, was a devastating indictment. They were all working for a company whose foundations were built on a lie. Julian, the star architect, had built his masterpiece using a stolen, misunderstood technology, and was now face to face with the woman whose legacy he had unknowingly inherited. He felt a wave of shame so profound it was nauseating. He, who prided himself on his intellectual purity, was a fraud. "I didn't know," he said, the words feeling hollow and useless. "No," Maria agreed. "You didn't. You simply benefited from the injustice. But now you do know, and your building is still going to collapse." "But the simulation," he protested. "It's stable now." "The simulation is stable because you reduced the load on that column," Maria corrected him. "But in the real world, you cannot simply reduce a column. You must remove it." The red line on the blueprint was not a suggestion. It was a command, and it is the only thing that will save this building and your career. Julian Croft felt the floor drop out from under him. The revelation of Maria's identity, coupled with her devastatingly simple command to remove a core support column, had shattered his reality. He, the celebrated genius, was not just wrong. He was a fraud, standing on the shoulders of a giant he had never even known existed. The silence in the studio was thick with the weight of 30 years of injustice. His team of engineers, who had once worshipped him, now looked back and forth between him and Maria, their expressions a mixture of awe for her and a new, critical reassessment of him. "Remove it," Julian finally choked out, the words tasting like poison. "That's not a solution, that's an execution. It violates every principle of structural engineering I've ever learned. The load calculations would be a nightmare. The entire base would have to be redesigned. No, it wouldn't, Maria said, her voice calm and steady, a lighthouse in his storm of panic. Your computers tell you that because you are asking them the wrong questions. You are asking them how to support a building. You should be asking them how a building can support itself. The matrix is a dynamic system, not a static frame. It is designed to redistribute stress and motion, like a flock of birds shifting in the wind. The column you see as essential is, in fact, a cage, preventing the system from doing the very thing it was designed to do. Her words were simple, yet they hinted at a level of understanding so profound it made his own prestigious education feel like a child's coloring book. He felt a hot flush of shame, followed by a desperate, clawing need to regain control. Run it again, he snapped at his team, pointing to the supercomputer. Model of full removal. I want to see the stress analysis. Every single vector. The engineers scrambled to comply, but their movements were different now. They were no longer following the orders of their infallible leader. They were testing the hypothesis of a quiet, elderly woman in a cleaner's uniform. Sarah, the young engineer, even glanced at Maria for a nod of confirmation before typing, a small gesture of deference that felt like a dagger in Julian's pride. As the simulation began to run, Julian paced the studio floor like a caged animal. There has to be another way, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. We can reinforce the existing columns, add dampeners, change the material composition. Those are patches, not solutions, Maria said from her position by the model. She hadn't moved. You are trying to silence the symptom, not cure the disease. The hum you hear, the dust at the base, that is the building telling you it is in pain. You can try to muffle its screams with more steel and concrete, but you cannot stop it from tearing itself apart from the inside out. I have seen it happen before. Her voice was heavy with the memory of the Hartford Bridge. The engineers on that project also thought they knew better. They called my design unnecessarily flexible. They added reinforcements to make it more rigid, more familiar. They valued their pride over my warnings. And 31 people paid the price for their arrogance when that bridge buckled in a crosswind. The story hung in the air, a chilling testament to the stakes they were facing. The simulation on the screen finished. The results were stark. With the column completely removed, the building was not just stable, it was significantly stronger. The stress loads, instead of concentrating in the core, were now distributed evenly across the entire structure. The harmonic resonance was gone. The ghost's equation was perfect. Julian stared at the screen, his mind a battlefield. His intellect told him the answer was right there, a beautiful, elegant solution. But his ego, his entire career, screamed that it was impossible. To go to the board, to the construction foreman, and tell them to remove a primary support column based on the advice of a disgraced, blacklisted engineer who had been cleaning his office. He would be a laughingstock. His career would be over. There must be a compromise, he insisted, his voice desperate. Something between your solution and the original design. Truth does not compromise, Maria said quietly. At that moment, the doors to the studio slid open. An older, impeccably dressed man strode in, his face a mask of cold fury. It was Arthur Sterling, the firm's founding partner, the man who had built his empire on the ashes of Maria's career. He was in his late 70s, but moved with the predatory energy of a much younger man. Croft, he barked, his eyes sweeping over the panicked team and the scale model. I just got a call from the construction lead. He says you've put a hold on the final structural sign-off. He says there are unforeseen complications. Explain yourself. Now. Julian flinched. Sterling was the one man he truly feared. Sir, he began, his voice trembling slightly. We've discovered a potential issue with harmonic resonance in the core. An issue? Sterling's voice dripped with venom. This project is $2 billion over budget and 6 months behind schedule. We do not have issues, Croft. We have solutions. What is it? Julian struggled to find the words. He couldn't bring himself to admit the truth. As he hesitated, Sterling's gaze fell on Maria, who was still standing silently by the model. He looked at her with the casual dismissal of a man who has not had to acknowledge a service worker in 50 years. And who is this? He demanded. Why is the cleaning staff in my design studio during a crisis? Before Julian could answer, Maria turned to face the man who had destroyed her life. She looked at him, and 30 years of forced silence, of quiet dignity in the face of profound injustice, fell away. "Hello, Arthur," she said, her voice calm and even. Sterling froze. He stared at her, his mind struggling to connect the face of the elderly cleaner with a ghost from his distant past. He saw the uniform, the age, the limp. But then he saw her eyes. The same brilliant, defiant eyes that had stared him down in a courtroom 30 years ago. "Maria Jones," he breathed, the name a curse on his lips. "What in God's name are you doing here?" "I am cleaning up your mess," Maria replied, her gaze unwavering. "Again, of course. I will continue the story, The Blueprint's Ghost, and ensure this part is longer and more detailed, as you requested. My apologies for the previous errors. Here is the fourth part of the story. Start of text file, part 4 of 5. Title, The Blueprint's Ghost. Arthur Sterling's face, a mask of aristocratic composure just moments before, contorted into a snarl of pure, venomous rage. The carefully constructed world he had ruled for 3 decades was being threatened by a ghost from his past, a woman he had crushed and buried, now resurrected in a cleaner's uniform. "Cleaning up my mess?" he hissed, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl that made the young engineers flinch. "You are the mess, Maria. A failed, disgraced engineer who almost took down a multi-million-dollar project with your reckless theories. I did this city a favor by removing you from the industry." He took a step towards her, his expensive shoes silent on the polished concrete floor. He was a man used to absolute power, used to people cowering before him. But Maria did not cower. She stood her ground, her quiet dignity an unshakable fortress. "The Hartford Bridge collapsed because you and your partners cut corners on my design," she said, her voice even and clear, cutting through his bluster. "You valued profit over safety. You ignored my warnings. And then you used me as your scapegoat. You didn't just take my patents, Arthur. You took my name. You took my life. I took what was forfeit." Sterling roared, his composure finally snapping. "You were a liability. Your career was over. I salvaged a brilliant concept from a failed academic. That's good business." "It's theft," Maria corrected him gently. "And now your star architect has used my stolen work to design a building that will collapse for the very same reason the bridge did. It seems you are not a very good student of history, Arthur." The insult, delivered so calmly, struck Sterling harder than any shout. He turned his furious gaze on Julian, who had been watching the exchange in a state of paralyzed horror. "Is this true, Croft?" Sterling demanded. "Is the design flawed?" Julian, caught between the titan who owned his career and the quiet woman who held its only solution, struggled to find his voice. He looked at the perfect simulation on the supercomputer screen, the one born from Maria's red pen, and he knew he could no longer deny the truth. "Yes, sir," he whispered, the admission tasting like ash. "The original design has a fatal flaw in the core's resonance frequency. Dr. Jones, she was right. Her solution works." The confession hung in the air, a final, devastating blow to Sterling's authority. He had been exposed, not just as a thief, but as a fool, in front of his own hand-picked prodigy. His empire was built on a stolen, misunderstood foundation, and the architect he had erased from history was the only one who could keep it from crumbling. He turned back to Maria, his expression shifting from rage to a cold, reptilian calculation. The shouting was over. The threats would now be quieter, more precise. "All right, Maria," he said, his voice now a smooth, dangerous purr. "You've made your point. You're a brilliant woman, a visionary. A terrible injustice was done to you. Now, let's talk about how to fix it. Name your price. I will write you a check, right now, for whatever you want. 10 million? 20? Enough to make you forget this unfortunate business and disappear again. You can have a quiet, comfortable retirement." It was the ultimate test, the weapon he had used his entire life to solve problems. Money. He was trying to buy her silence, to reduce her 30 years of stolen legacy to a simple transaction. The young engineers watched, holding their breath. They were seeing the raw, brutal mechanics of power up close. Maria looked at the impossibly wealthy man before her, a man who believed everything and everyone had a price tag. And for the first time that day, she smiled. It was a sad, weary smile, but it held no trace of defeat. "My silence is not for sale, Arthur," she said. Not for any price. I am not here for money. I am here for that building. And for my name. What do you want? Sterling asked, his voice tight with frustration. I want what you took from me, she replied. I want public credit for the design of the Jones Matrix. I want my name on the patent for the Sterling core. And I want my engineering license, which you and your friends on the review board had stripped from me, to be reinstated with a formal, public apology from this firm. The demands were an act of war. She wasn't just asking for restitution. She was demanding a complete rewriting of history, an unraveling of the very lie upon which Sterling and Croft was built. Sterling stared at her, a slow, incredulous laugh escaping his lips. You are in no position to make demands, he said. You are a cleaner. You trespassed in this studio. You defaced company property. I could have you arrested. Go ahead, Maria said, calling his bluff. Have me arrested. Put me on the stand. I would love nothing more than to tell a jury, under oath, the entire history of Sterling and Croft's business practices, starting with the Hartford Bridge. I imagine the families of the 31 people who died that day would be very interested to hear it. The threat was perfectly aimed. She had him. They both knew it. Sterling's face was a thundercloud. He was a king being checkmated by a pawn. He looked at Julian, then at his team of engineers, all of whom were now looking at Maria with undisguised admiration. He had lost the room. He had lost control. This is blackmail, he hissed. No, Maria said. This is justice. It has just been delayed by 30 years. She turned to Julian. The final sign-off for the Apex is in 2 days. You have a choice. You can follow your boss's lead and build a beautiful, expensive tombstone, or you can listen to the engineer who knows how to save it. The decision is yours, Mr. Croft. But know this. If you proceed with the flawed design, I will not remain silent. I will go to every news station, every engineering board, and I will tell them exactly what you are building and why it will fall. She turned and walked towards the door, her limp seeming less pronounced, her posture straighter than it had been in years. She had said her piece. She had given them the truth. Now, it was up to them to decide what to do with it. She paused at the door, looking back at Julian Croft, the young man who had built his dream on her stolen one. Choose wisely, son, she said, her voice softer now, almost kind. A building is not the only thing that can collapse under the weight of a lie. Maria's final words hung in the studio like a judge's sentence. After she left, the silence she left behind was deafening. Julian Croft stood frozen, trapped between the legacy of two powerful figures, Arthur Sterling, the man who could destroy his future, and Maria Jones, the woman who had just handed him its only salvation. Sterling's face was a thundercloud of pure fury. He stalked over to Julian, his voice a low, venomous whisper. This changes nothing, Sterling hissed, his voice barely audible but carrying the weight of an iron command. You will sign off on the original blueprints tomorrow morning. We will proceed as planned. This, ghost, will be dealt with. Do you understand me, Croft? Julian looked from Sterling's cold, merciless eyes to the beautiful, flawed model of the Apex. He saw the future Sterling was offering him, a career built on a lie, a skyscraper that was a ticking time bomb, and the blood of potentially hundreds on his hands. Then he thought of Maria's quiet dignity, the calm certainty in her eyes, and her final, haunting words, a building is not the only thing that can collapse under the weight of a lie. In that moment, something inside Julian shifted. The ambitious, arrogant prodigy who had only ever sought fame and validation was eclipsed by a man who was suddenly, terrifyingly aware of the real cost of his dreams. No, Julian said, the word small but solid. Sterling recoiled as if slapped. What did you say? I said no, sir, Julian repeated, his voice gaining strength. He looked at his team of engineers, who were watching him with a mixture of terror and a dawning, unexpected respect. I will not sign off on a design that I know is fatally flawed. I will not be responsible for another Hartford Bridge. You are finished, Croft, Sterling roared, his face turning a blotchy red. I will ruin you. You will never work in this city, in this country again. I will personally see to it that your name becomes a synonym for incompetence. Then so be it, Julian said, turning his back on Sterling. He walked over to the supercomputer terminal where the corrected simulations still glowed a cool, stable green. But I will not build a tombstone. He looked at his team, I need a full structural analysis based on Dr. Jones's modifications ready for the board by morning. Who is with me? For a tense heartbeat, no one moved. Then Sarah, the young engineer, stepped forward. I am, she said, her voice clear. One by one, the other engineers joined her, leaving Arthur Sterling standing alone in the middle of the studio, a king who had just lost his kingdom. The next 24 hours were a blur of frantic, focused work. Julian and his team, energized by a newfound sense of purpose, worked through the night, redesigning the core structure based on Maria's single, brilliant correction. They discovered the genius of her original matrix, the way it created a strength through flexibility they had never imagined. The emergency board meeting was a bloodbath. Sterling, arrogant to the last, tried to paint Julian as a hysterical, incompetent subordinate being manipulated by a disgraced and delusional old woman. But Julian was prepared. He presented the data, the simulations, and a clear, concise explanation of the catastrophic flaw. He didn't just show them the problem. He showed them the elegant, undeniable solution. The Sterling core, the very technology our firm is built on, Julian announced to the stunned board members, is a lie. It is a stolen, misunderstood version of a system called the Jones Matrix, designed 30 years ago by Dr. Maria Jones, the woman who has been cleaning our offices for the past 5 years. He then played the security footage of Maria marking the blueprint, a silent, damning testament to the truth. The board, faced with the irrefutable proof of a potential catastrophe and a 30-year-old injustice, acted swiftly. Arthur Sterling was forced into an immediate, unceremonious retirement. The final construction sign-off for the Apex was indefinitely postponed. 2 weeks later, Sterling and Croft held a press conference. Julian Croft, now the interim head of the firm, stood at the podium. But he was not alone. Beside him stood Maria Jones. She was not in a cleaner's uniform, but in a simple, elegant suit, her posture straight, her eyes clear. Today is a day of reckoning for this firm, Julian began, his voice ringing with a humility no one had ever heard from him before. He told the assembled reporters the whole story. The story of the Hartford Bridge, of the stolen patents, of the brilliant woman who was erased from history. He publicly apologized, on behalf of the entire firm, to Dr. Maria Jones. We cannot undo the injustice of the past, he said. But we can begin to build a new future based on the truth. Effective today, the Sterling core will be officially and legally renamed the Jones Matrix. Dr. Jones's name will be restored to all patents, and she has been offered the position of senior structural consultant to oversee the final construction of the Apex, her masterpiece. The story was a bombshell. It dominated the news for weeks, a modern fable of corporate greed, stolen legacy, and ultimate redemption. Maria Jones, the ghost in the machine, became a symbol of quiet resilience and overlooked genius. She did not, however, accept a full-time position. She accepted the consultant role for the Apex, and, with the massive financial settlement the firm had offered her, she established the Dr. Maria Jones Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing scholarships and mentorship to promising young engineers from underprivileged and minority backgrounds. She spent the next 2 years overseeing the construction of the Apex, working alongside Julian not as a subordinate or a savior, but as a partner. The building rose into the sky, not just as a marvel of architecture, but as a monument to the truth. On the day of its grand opening, Maria stood on the observation deck, looking out at the city skyline she had finally, irrevocably shaped. Beside her stood Julian, and on her other side, a bright-eyed young woman who was the first recipient of her foundation scholarship. "It's beautiful," the young woman whispered, staring out at the view. "Yes, it is," Maria said, a quiet, satisfied smile on her face. It just needed to learn how to breathe. How many masterpieces are never built, not because of a flaw in the design, but because of a flaw in the people who hold the blueprints? And how many ghosts are waiting in the wings, ready to remind us that true genius can never truly be erased? If this story inspired you to look for the hidden architects in your own world, please like, subscribe, and share. You never know whose truth you might help to build.